Hello and welcome back to the Church Communications Strategy Training course. This is session 2 in our 7-week series. My name is Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology at Concordia Publishing House. Part of my responsibilities is leading the marketing efforts for our Concordia Technology Solutions team. So my contact information is on there. I have just my email address today. During this COVID-19 sheltering in place, I've been spending time both at home and in the office. I'm presenting from the office right now because at home, we've got a bunch of other people, my wife and kids, who are using the internet, and I don't want anything to interrupt this presentation today. So I'm in a big, empty 5-story building. It's been a lot of fun kind of being one of the few people here. Well, today is, again, the second session in our training series. So some of these things may sound familiar, but I want to go over some housekeeping items before we begin. My plan for today is 50 minutes for presentation and then 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm notorious for going over those 50 minutes or any amount of time I set. I tend to push the limits, and then I'm willing to stay late for Q&A. So that'll probably happen today, but this is my plan. I'm going to shoot for this. All attendees are muted. And I've only had one instance where all of a sudden somebody was not muted and I wasn't sure how that happened. So you won't be able to speak if you hear something or I hear something that's not part of this. Well, that's not intentional, and we'll address that then. But that doesn't mean just because you are not able to speak to the entire group that we don't want your feedback or your questions. You can ask questions through the chat. I'll be answering those questions during the Q&A. And if you have any questions about when the course materials will be presented or anything like that, one of my associates, James, is on the line to answer those questions in the chat too. But I will tell you that we are recording this. That is our most popular question. When will we be recording this? Can I watch this afterwards? The answer is yes. And we do have session 1 available for you to watch. I also made a super fast 3-minute review of session 1 that I shared on our Facebook page yesterday. So you can always watch that if you don't have time for the whole session. But we will be sharing the recording. You can expect it via email tomorrow. We'll share the link to it. I'll also point to our resource center later on today as well. That's where we kind of house everything. But enough of that. Let's go back to talking about what's included in the Church Communications Strategy Training course. This might be your first session. You may not have been able to make it last week. I'm going to go through these rather briefly. Well, first off, every Tuesday from 1 to 2 Central Time, all the way between now and June 9th, which actually isn't that far away anymore, we're going to have a weekly webinar, which is what you're watching right now. We're going to have a weekly blog post. That'll launch at the very end of the webinar. So I've got that scheduled to release at 2 o'clock Central Time today. And at the bottom of the webinar, there's a weekly download. And that has a worksheet for you to kind of take what you learned in the webinar and put it into practice in your church. Now, if you go to the blog and go to download the weekly download, the worksheet, it's going to ask you to fill out a form and everything. That's kind of burdensome. There's no reason for you to do that. I've put it in the handouts for you, and I also put last week's in there too. So if you look in your GoToWebinar panel, under handouts, you should see 2 different documents that you can download. Feel free to download those now. You can follow along with it. It's not an exact one-for-one with the course, but it's diving in deeper to what we're talking about today. In case you're looking ahead, this is our schedule for this course. Last week we talked about ministry goals. This week we're talking about persona profiles. We're going to move into journey maps and content maps. Those are 2 of my favorite topics. Then we'll jump into social media, which is usually our most popular topic, church websites, which is far more important than people give it credit for. And finally, we'll get into the campaigns. That's where you really get practical and start putting everything together. So that's our schedule. But a quick recap from last week. We talked about what a strategy is. That's what this whole course is about, putting together a strategy. A strategy is a plan for achieving a goal. That's it. That is very basics. A communications strategy is a little bit different. It's a plan for sharing the right message with the right audience at the right time. Everything we talk about is going to affect one of those things, whether it's the message or the audience or the timing. So what are goals? That was a big topic of discussion last week. Well, goals are specific desirable results that has not yet been achieved. That's different than a process, which is something you should be doing as a standard operating procedure at your church. Well, we gave a number of examples. I'll just give you one. A process might be welcoming visitors with the love of Christ, where our goal would be to host 3 welcome events and invite the community. I hope you can see that difference. One is about your standard operating procedure, what you do day in, day out. The other is something very specific, which you're hoping to accomplish by a point in time. Now, both goals and processes are important as part of the communication strategy. I'll be coming back to those a number of times, which is why I wanted to review today. Goals allow everyone to focus on what's most important. And when we talk today about personas, that's where goals come in and say, okay, we have a large group in our audience, but who should we be focusing on, or how should we be focusing our messaging for those that are most important to our mission? We want to be all things to all people, but we can't do that on a practical, tangible level day in, day out. So where are we going to focus? So as you look at goals and look at personas, you'll see how those fit together. Goals also give the reason to say yes or no to tactics. As we look at persona profiles, and I'll explain all of that soon, you're going to see where sometimes we're going to say yes, because of our persona, we're going to try this. And other times we're just going to say no. It is a very good thing for some people to do, for some churches or schools or nonprofits, but because of our personas, we're not going to do that. Well, we went through this process of establishing the baseline of your ministry. What is that standard operating procedure? Well, then we found out where you can stretch. So those two things tie into some of the best practices in ministry. We establish our baseline by doing a SWOT analysis, and that's what one of the handouts includes, where you look at the positive and negative church characteristics and the positive and negative environment traits. We also talked about mission statements, identifying the who, what, and why of your church. This will become important as we begin talking about personas. And then goals, we described SMART goals, which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Well, I wanted to give some better examples. I felt after last week, I talked very theoretical, but I didn't get into the nitty-gritty. So let's look at some example organizations, and we're going to use these throughout the rest of the course. Now that we're getting into some real actionable items, certainly SWOT analysis, mission statements, ministry goals, those are very actionable, but we're going to start getting into communication actions. Let's look at 4 different organizations that we can use as examples throughout this course. The first one, Christ Community Church, a large church in a growing suburb. That is going to distinguish itself with its goal in a number of different ways. But the goal that we're focused on with Christ Community Church is to increase active participation and new summer Bible studies to 35% of the congregation. Now, 35% is not even the majority, but for this congregation, that's a stretch. They're used to having people coming in to worship on a weekly basis, but getting that deeper dive into scripture after the fact, that's been tough. They've been hovering around 10 to 20% of their attendance. And so they have this stretch goal of getting up to 35% of their congregation attending summer Bible studies. That's a little bit aggressive. Next, we have St. Paul Lutheran Church, a small church in a rural city. In fact, I don't even know if you can call it a city, it's so small. Well, their goal is to increase the number of church-sponsored community-focused events to 1 per quarter. They have gotten so used to doing what they're doing that they are inward focused. And so they've identified that one of their weaknesses is that the community has no connection to them. So they're going to do 4 community events, 1 per quarter, and that's their goal. Next, let's look at Lutheran School, Concordia Lutheran School, a small school in a suburban city. Well, that school building may not look like a suburban city, but I couldn't find a better picture, so we're going with it. Their goal is to increase enrollment of students from 200 to 225 by the start of the next academic year. Now that number, 200 to 225, that shows they're not a really large school, but they're also not a really small school either. So they're kind of right in the middle, and adding 25 students would make quite a bit of difference in tuition and helping to pay for all their staffing and really improve their class sizes. So that's why they're going with that goal. And trust me, 25 new students is always a stretch. Finally, we're going to talk about Hope in Christ Foundation. Now, they're a local funder of homeless ministries in an urban center. Their goal is to increase the amount of recurring monthly gifts by 20% to $30,000 per month by year end. So they've already done a lot of work with this. They're just trying to go up to that 20% to 30,000. But that often, that little stretch of percent, 20% is still rather large, but $5,000 a month, that can take some time and effort, but it's a very specific goal. And of course, all of these are written in the SMART mentality. So now we get into our topic for today, persona profiles. Persona profiles are all about understanding your audience. And I have to say, out of every topic in this course, this is probably the one that most churches haven't thought about. I know lots of churches have gone through that process of ministry goals. And as we get into talking about journey maps, that phrase may not be familiar to churches, but I think they think in those ways. And so we're going to take the thoughts and put them into a plan. And certainly as you look at social media and church websites and campaigns, those are all pretty common and under one name or another. But persona profiles, I haven't heard of too many churches who do that, at least as part of their regular process, until they go through a training course like this. Well, let's first off define personas. A persona is a fictional representation of your target audience. A persona profile is a detailed description of your persona. And we'll get into this in quite a bit of detail, but you'll see in the handout an example of a persona and a persona profile, and we'll give you some more as we get forward. But let's talk about first how you might use this. Is you look at a persona profile where you document everything about this fictional person. What does it even matter? Is this just an exercise in putting together some fun profiles? Well, no. As you go about using personas and communications, they become critical from a strategic perspective. They may not change your day-to-day as much, but I think you'll see how they affect your strategy, which of course will dictate what you do on a day-to-day basis. All right, a persona, having personas, I should say, adds personalization to your communication rather than generalization. So think with me for a second about I'm going to say stereotypical communications of a church. And we're going to say back 10, 20 years. I'm hoping that your church doesn't do just this. It probably still does this on a regular basis, and that's okay. But communications centered around two key things, and some churches combine them. The weekly bulletin that included news and announcements, birthdays and the schedule of events, a printed bulletin that everybody would get when they come into worship, and then a monthly newsletter, which is mailed to everyone's house. Now, as you think about those two things, and that's what a lot of people in the church office staff focused on, and again, to be honest, still focus on today. These haven't gone away, but they're just augmented or supplemented with other things. But as you look at those two things, what do you have to do with them? Well, you're doing one bulletin per week, one newsletter per month. You want to get everything in there, which means that everyone in your congregation, and maybe some of those outside of your congregation, are reading this one document, or in this case, we're talking two documents. But as you get this document, you have to be very generalized in what you're saying. For one, the topics that you put in there are very broad. It's everything in the church that's coming up. The only thing that cuts off or restricts it is the calendar, because you're going to have another one coming out next week or next month. But otherwise, everything else goes in there. And that process is tough. I know that from working with churches, how stressful that can be to the office administrators who are trying to get that out on a regular basis, and they keep getting submissions from people at a later date than they wanted. It's Friday afternoon. Can you add this to the bulletin for this weekend? Oh, we've already printed them out and stapled them. No, we can't. So these are very much generalized for a large audience, and personas take that and say, there are different people with different needs, with different goals supporting those needs in our congregation. We can't do a one size fits all. So that's the key part of personas, is they cause you to pause, look at your audience, and figure out how to personalize them in a variety of different ways. Personas remind you that you are communicating with individuals and not just data points. It's easy to go on the other side of it and say, all right, well, we've got 500 followers on Facebook. Let's get this out to them. You start getting intrigued and excited by the numbers. And I have that same tendency in the marketing here. Look at how many people signed up for this training course. This is exciting. Well, if we take personas and put into the mix, we realize these aren't just numbers. These are people with actual needs. And so as I think about the personas that I have for this course, there's two in particular that come in mind. There is the volunteer who is giving up their time and their evenings and weekends to help the church get into this realm of digital technology and social media and video, who has never done this in a church setting before, maybe in the professional career, but not in a church setting. And then you have the office manager who is so used to this typical way we've been doing things, the print pieces, who is doing this day in, day out, but now knows there's an opportunity outside in the digital realm too. So those are two that come in mind. I have several others that I'm working through as I go through this process for the training course. So think about your church and all the different people and all the different needs. It's going to be really hard to meet all of those needs for everybody. That's why you have personas. You focus on a few of them. So personas will shape how you communicate. They will shape what you communicate, the means you use to communicate, and to whom. You'll see this much more tangible as we get on. But the how you communicate, the words that you use, it's going to be different for different personas. There's generational differences, there's family backgrounds. You can't possibly get everybody, but if you start looking at it in a broad spectrum, you can start finding these groups. We're really going to get into some different ways you group people. What you communicate is also going to be a key part of personas. Like I said before, with this typical newsletter bulletin model, you're communicating everything. Well, if you take a step back and say, well, here are the personas that we're focused on, or maybe we're only focused on this one. These things over here don't matter to that person, so I'm not going to worry about sending it to them. Or maybe this persona, they don't get mail. They're not used to seeing, going to their mailbox and getting anything other than ads. I'm not going to spend time and money putting a newsletter together for them when they're not going to read it. Or maybe you just say, I'm not going to send it to this person. I'm only going to send it to these, because this person, none of this information in here that was written for this persona applies to this group. So we're going to split it and do things differently. All of this will be very tangible as we get forward, very specific, but that's where it starts with personas. I hope that makes sense. If you've got questions about this, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Let me know for the Q&A time. I'm excited to see if the newsletter and bulletin sounds familiar to you, maybe from your past, maybe from your present. But let's talk about how we go about determining personas for your audience. And again, audience is whoever is receiving your communication. So it might be in a church setting, might be your members, but also the community at large. In the school setting, it's going to be those families or prospective families. In the nonprofit setting, it might be your donors, or it might be the people you're serving. So your audience is those who receive your communication. Well, let's start by talking about Christ Community Church. And if you remember from a few minutes ago, they are a large church in a growing suburb. Their goal is to increase participation, active participation in new summer Bible studies to 35% of the congregation. That's their goal. And we're going to talk about how goals and mission statements figure into personas in a few minutes. But let's just look at this one specific scenario, this one specific goal right now. They have determined that there are 3 different types of people in their church that they want in Bible study during the summer. The first one is Millennial Melody. She is a single 25-year-old who is actively involved in youth group as a teen and is trying to regain connection to the church as an adult. Now think about your church. Do you have anybody like that? Do you want to have people like that? If you don't have many people, I'm sure you certainly want people like that. I hear it time and time again, we don't have young people involved. I know at my church, there are a number of people in their 20s. And when I say number, I mean like 12 or less. It's not a huge number, but there's specific people that are in this transitional stage of their life, and they don't know where they fit into the church. They're no longer in youth group in high school. They're not into the parenting stage yet. They're not even married. So how do they fit in? Well, Bible studies is a fantastic way. And so this Christ Community Church has identified that persona as one of their target audiences for this goal. Next, you have 40-ish Fred. Fred is a 42-year-old father whose schedule revolves around kids and work. It's a struggle for him to get involved in anything much outside of worship. Obviously, I'm bringing in a lot of my personal experiences into this course, but I can think of numerous people in my congregation. And I should clarify, the genders don't matter here. They're just a personification of this type of person. I can think of many people who are in that middle adult range in my congregation who they're still working, they still have kids, they are faithful attenders at worship. They just don't have that much time in their day to study God's word. And so that's where this gentleman, 40-ish Fred, comes in. He's got that same pain point of time. Well, finally, we have older adult Alice. Now, she's on a whole different end of the spectrum from millennial Melody. She's 72 years old, finally starting to admit that she needs some assistance with her health. She's had some health issues for a while, but her biggest thing is she's fearful of losing her independence. And so thinking about summer Bible studies, that's a way to engage her with God's word, help her have a little bit of independence where she's leaving the house, she's not going to doctor's visits, she's getting involved within the family of Christ. So these are our three very different personas. Let's talk about what they have in common, and then we'll get into where they're truly different. Well, first off, what do they have in common as members? Well, we are considering all of these to be members. They are not outreach opportunities here. We might have some situations, but in this specific instance at Christ Community Church, they're all members. So we're narrowing our focus down on people we know. We also know they're all active. Now, Millennial Melody is a little bit iffy. She's actively trying to regain a connection, but she hasn't really been successful yet. And 40-ish Fred is active in worship, but he's not active elsewhere. So that definition is a little iffy, but I think the intention is there for all of them. Well, now we look at communication preferences. Email. Well, yeah, they all use email. Millennial Melody is in the workforce now. A few years ago, you might not have been able to get her on email, but now it's a requirement for her. And of course, Fred is invested in that as part of his work. And older adult Alice, she's found that that's the best way to communicate with her family. And then finally, desire to stay informed. Well, yeah, they all want to stay informed in different ways. Like that's a key thing for them. How they go about it might be different. Let's look at where do they differ. That's where you really start to see this separation among personas. Well, their communication preferences. Millennial Melody still prefers social. That's where she spends her time. But like before, Fred is invested in email. That's how his work goes. That's how his personal life goes. And even though Alice uses email, it's not her preference. She prefers that physical, tangible bulletin. So that's a key thing where it's different. Also availability. Well, yeah, Millennial Melody, as she's working, weekends are the best time for her. Now, she doesn't have kids. She doesn't have kids' sporting events to go to. So weekends are still open for her, whereas Fred, even though weeknights can be busy because of the kids' commitments, they're nothing like the weekend. The weekend is packed. So his weeknights are better for him. And then older adult Alice, she doesn't like to go out at night. She's having trouble seeing. The dark really makes it tough for her to drive. So weekdays are far better. All right, now what about the financial situation? Does this matter on Bible studies? Well, maybe. It might if you're requiring people to buy in a course. Well, Millennial Melody, she's still paying off her college loan. She's at an entry-level job. She has no available finances. Fred's in good shape. He's been working for a number of years. Older adult Alice, she's on a fixed income. She's not working anymore. So she's getting Social Security and that's about it. So those are things to keep in mind as you're looking at who has to pay for what for Bible studies. And finally, from an interest standpoint, well, what is motivating them to attend Bible studies? Well, certainly Millennial Melody is there about the fellowship. Fred's interest is focused on worship. And so he sees Bible studies as an extension beyond that. That's how you can get him encouraged to attend, because he sees that as just one more thing that supports his overall faith development. And older adult Allison, she's looking for fellowship, but in a different way. She's looking to retain a connection. Melody's looking to add a connection. All right, so we've got some very different personas, but I hope you can understand how you would begin to communicate with them differently. So how do you determine the personas in your church? Well, in general, I would say that every adult in your congregation should be easily assigned to a persona. And easily is probably the hardest word there. You want to make your personas broad enough that they can be assigned to anyone in your congregation, anyone in your known audience. But they also should be specific enough to accurately describe how to communicate with those individual members. So I'm not going to say this is an easy task, but I think as you start going through this, as you're looking at different personas, think about the people in your congregation. Could you assign them to one of your proposed personas? You'll start off with a list, and you'll start saying, okay, that guy, he'd go here and she would go there. Use that to start. When you get into the nitty-gritty, you may have to make some stretches, but that's what you're trying to accomplish, is have them be both general enough that everybody has a persona and specific enough that they really do influence your communications. So I would recommend to start with your mission statement and say, who are you called to reach? Like we said before, that's the who, what, and why of your congregation. So who are you called to reach? What types of people are in that segment of your community, of your, obviously your church is who you're called to reach, but how far out are you going? Then move to your ministry goals. Who is the goal recipient? If you have clearly defined ministry goals, you're going to have some very clearly defined personas, or at least you should by the time we're done here. It'll be easier when you have a specific ministry goal. How you assign them will be maybe a little bit easier to say, all right, I know this is the goal, and just like we were looking at before with Bible studies, I know there are some different challenges facing different people, so let's split them up and create personas for them. So then you can add any other personas, and that's where you start getting into it. Well, I don't know where to fit this person in, and this person probably has that same problem of fitting in. Add personas as needed. I would recommend keeping it fewer than 8. If you can get down to half that, that's even better. And so that's where you start looking at it. Well, if I start looking at everybody individually, this is going to be really tough to get down to like 4 to 8. But if you focus on a few key things, you might be able to look at that as your dividing line and then do a generalization around that. And I'm going to give you some examples. So we're going to look at 4 different examples, and I put them in the order on your handout. I completed the handout before I decided how I wanted to put them in the order here. So that'll be a little bit different. But you could do it by communication, you could do it by demographics, do it by participation, or by interests. We're gonna look at each one of those. And there's others beyond this. It's taking this division of personas and focusing on one key area so that you can allow your people to kind of self-identify into those specific groupings. And what I mean by that is if you are doing some kind of form online where people sign up for something, or you're doing a paper form, or you're doing a survey, you could say, which of these best describe you? Now, if you remember when you signed up for the course, I asked that same thing, what best describes you? What role are you in the congregation? That role is really key for us here at CTS and at Concordia Publishing House. We use it in both places because in general, we can determine based on your role what kind of things you're looking for. Now, everybody's different, everybody's unique, everybody has different desires, but for us, that's that primary thing. We have so many different products here, so many different services that we don't want to send everything to everyone based on communication preferences. Well, you're going to find out about our church software and our offering envelopes and our VBS all through email because you're our email persona. Well, that doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for you, our audience. And so that's where we look at role. So these 4 types are really going to help us distinguish our personas in a given church or given organization. Now, one thing to keep in mind, personas may be the recipient of more than one goal. You might have goals that overlap, and you say, well, where do I put this person? How do I assign them to a persona when two goals are going for that same kind of person? When you think about somebody like 40-ish Fred, you might have a goal of increasing Bible study attendance, but he'd also really be good to increase leadership in the church because of his experience. Well, which one's he going to go into? So keep that in mind. That's why you have your goals first and your mission statement first. You're looking at that as kind of your global universe of priorities, and then your personas get split from there. All right, we're going to go back to Christ Community Church for a second. Again, we have our 3 personas. We know what our goal is. These are divided by demographics. That's what we talked about, the different stages in their life. Now, we could divide them in any number of ways, but this is how we chose to split our audience into that personas for this church. Well, let's talk about St. Paul Lutheran Church. Their goal is to increase the number of church-sponsored community-focused events to 1 per quarter. Well, we could look at dividing personas by any one of those ones, but what if we focused on participation? What kind of personas would we put together when we're looking at participation? Well, first off, at a small rural congregation, I guarantee you're going to find some lifelong Larrys. They have lived in this small rural city for a very long time, and they were baptized at the church and confirmed there, and by golly, they're going to die there and have their funeral there too. Well, yeah, I'm sure you know people like that. There might be people in your church or in your family who are like that. There's a lot of them at St. Paul. Well, you also have regular Rebecca. She's not a lifelong member, but she's moved to this community and she's there every Sunday. You know you can count on Rebecca. She may have a job, but it's a little bit slower life in the rural city, and so she's able to fill out more of her vocations or live out more of her vocations in the church. Well, then you have occasional Olivia. Olivia is in the community. There's not really that many things to do. She kind of grew up in the church, but she's there from time to time. She's not disconnected entirely, but she's also not there as much as regular Rebecca. As you work with your congregation, or as St. Paul works with their congregation to increase the number of church-sponsored events, all of those people are important people to consider how you communicate to them. Larry's going to be there no matter what. Rebecca's most likely going to be there, but their timing and everything is different. Well, and this might be a way to get Olivia a little bit more engaged, but you're going to have to approach her in a different way. You can't just expect her to see a bulletin notice if she's not there every week. So personas based on participation are a great way to divide it up depending on what your goals are. Well, let's look at a school example. Concordia Lutheran School, again, their goal is to increase enrollment. Well, if we divided up our personas based on interest, I think you'll see where this works out very well. If your goal is to increase enrollment, what kind of messaging do you share with people? Well, there's so many different things you can share. You can talk about, what your school community is like, the different activities, the life enrichment activities. I know at our school, we have all sorts of different things. We have robotics club and after school math club and sports and all of that. But our primary goal is our faith development. So people who are considering the school are going to be interested in different things. So you might have Faithful Felicity. She's a grandma who is looking for a school for her grandkids that she cares for. And she has so much life experience to tell her that academics are important, everything else is important, but nothing as important as having a good, solid Christian education. And so that's why she's looking at your school. You might have Athletic Aubrey, who is very much into athletics. That's how she really kind of came out of her shell in elementary school. She had found that camaraderie as a teammate in high school. Now she's wanting her kids to experience that same thing. And so, athletics is by far her #1 priority, not just because she likes playing sports, but because she knows what that does for kids as they develop. And then finally, you might have Curriculum Corey, who is all about the academics. That's where he kind of excelled. And he kind of sees himself as an expert of being able to figure out what a good curriculum looks like. Well, all of them are potential families for your school, but they're going to be looking at different things. And so it certainly shapes what message you're going to share with them. And it's pretty easy to self-identify too. Whether they are filling out a request, a tour form on your website, or you're having a conversation with them, you can figure out what their priorities are pretty quickly. Now, in this case, things like demographics and communication don't matter at all. Even though you might have some different ages, that doesn't matter on the persona. You're going to focus on their interest. All right, let's go to Hope in Christ Foundation. Their goal is to increase their recurring monthly gifts. Well, certainly there's some financial backing that goes into that. That's the whole goal. And so you might be able to divide up your givers, your donors, based on how much income they have. But you might be surprised how hard that is to tell. I know within our congregation setting, I'm always kind of surprised who are the ones who are the big donors and who aren't. So in this case, let's talk about how to divide it by communication preferences. This is probably one of the easiest ways to do it, but in a church setting or school setting, you are doing a lot of communication in a variety of different ways. There's things going on a daily and weekly basis. Whereas in a nonprofit organization like Hope in Christ, well, everything's much more intentional. There's less about activities and more about relationships. So how do you build those relationships? Well, you focus on communication and their preferences. So we've got Social Sarah, who is all about social media. She loves sharing those positive stories of what the recipients of the gifts from Hope in Christ are doing in their ministries, helping the homeless in a number of ways. You'll see her there taking pictures and sharing them and thanking Hope in Christ. She is all about telling the stories. Well, email Elliot. He is very much engaged in the ministry of Hope in Christ, but he's not really big into social media. He is in that working world. He's focused on email, but if you send him an email, he's going to get it and he's going to respond to it. And I'll tell you, it's interesting as I look at you who are attending here. We did a number of social posts and we did some things, outside of email, but I knew that as soon as I sent the email and as soon as I sent the reminder, I was going to get a lot of signups, because that's the kind of audience that you guys are like. You're very engaged in email because of where you're at in your vocations. And so while that's not one of our personas, it certainly could be one. We understand that's a strength for us because some people prefer just email. Well, then finally you have your visiting Victor. And Victor is, he's not really interested in digital media. Neither social media nor email is going to get him. And in fact, even if you send him a letter, he might look at it, but that's not what's going to cause him to give. But if you go and you have coffee with him or you meet with him at his house, you can guarantee that you're going to have a big donation because he likes that personal touch. I'm sure you know people like that in your organization. So as you step back and you look at those 4 different types of divisions, you can start to think about your situation. What are your goals? How would you divide them up? Do any of these resonate with you more than another? Now, just because we split them up by church and school and nonprofit doesn't mean you have to go with that exact same division, but I think you can see how this starts to apply for your entire audience. Let's dig into persona profiles. If you have any questions about that process of identifying what your personas are, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll talk about them in the Q&A in a little while. Let's get into writing persona profiles. Well, a persona profile gives your personas a name, a face, a personality, and a story. I shared that with you in a very brief way for all of our different personas. We had those 12 different personas, and I gave you a little bit of background on each. I'm sure you could probably resonate with all of them, whether with yourself or with people in your church. You probably know them. They're pretty general. Well, this provides a single reference point of your persona for your team and yourself. As you go through the work of defining your persona and writing their story, really identifying with them, it's going to be easier if you have this one single reference point to always come back to me. Like, no, I know I did the work. I'm not going to stretch it. This is who Lifelong Larry is. They also provide accountability for better planning and implementation of the plan. When you think about it and you've got these 3-4 personas listed out and you go to build a plan and you say, I really like this new social media platform. I kind of give TikTok a hard time. Like, I want to use TikTok. It doesn't really fit with any of my personas over here, but we could add a new persona for TikTok. Yeah, see, you can tell where I'm coming from. don't stretch your personas just because of the fun new tools that come out there. It's about accountability for who your audience and who your ministry is. And so it's okay to say no to the latest and greatest. And you might find in your congregation that nobody is on Facebook. It seems like everybody's on Facebook, but you might find as you go through this process that they're not. Use your personas to say yes or no to different things. So what does a persona profile actually look like? Well, here's an example. I pulled this from a stock site, Envato, which is a fantastic tool. They've got a great subscription plan. They give you these kind of templates. So the template that you can download, and by the way, if you're just joining us, take a look in the handouts. There's a free template there. This is something that, I like to go and look at stock photography sites or stock graphic sites. They've expanded beyond photography, and they give some good examples. So this is one way of doing it, pretty black and white with a little bit of color in there. You could go really creative with color and graphs and other things like this one. This is an example of ours here. The one on the left side of the screen is what we use for CTS. That's our Treasurer Tom profile. And then on the right-hand side, what we use for CPH globally, our secretary, our church member, and then the names are in there, Secretary Shirley, member Melanie, they're in there as well. But how you design this is up to you. And so what you'll find in that handout is we give you one example, and it's pretty basic. I didn't want to get into it too much because I'd love to see what kind of creativity you come up with, but it's also going to be hard to make a template that's super creative. So if you go to that next page, you'll see there's an opening. You could start with that. I would recommend you expand, make it your own, but this is a few options for you. So the basics of a persona profile: give them a name. You notice how everything kind of sounds, I forget what the right phrase is for it, but like Lifelong Larry, it starts with the same letters, something memorable. Put a photo at them. Again, the gender doesn't necessarily matter. That might matter depending on your goal. If your goal is to increase gender-specific Bible studies, you want a men's Bible study and women's Bible study, well, yeah, that's going to be your division point, but it doesn't have to be. So you give them an appropriate photo that is how you picture them in your mind. And then write a biography for them. Give them a little bit of background. You can be specific without it mattering as much because it personifies them. Don't use specific histories. If somebody in your congregation looked at your persona profile, you don't want them to be like, well, this is all about me. You want it to be a collection of all the people in that persona. And so make it general enough that nobody's going to say, yeah, that is me, but they can say, I can relate to that. Now, you're not actually going to share this with people, but I think that's a good rule of thumb to think about as you develop it. Demographic information. Give them an age, give them family, give them background, give them a home life. All of those things, again, create a more fuller picture of a person. Some of those things might help you distinguish between different personas depending on how you divide them up. Somebody who's in their 40s with kids is very different than somebody who's in their 40s without kids. Priorities really change for them. So you might have two people where the age, or two personas where the ages are the same, but because of that family situation, you're going to approach them entirely differently. Again, that depends on your mission and your goals as an organization. Educational. Degrees, learning style, value of education, occupation, all of those kind of things kind of factor in to how you might talk with them. If it's a distinguishing point where you have, and we'll get into some theological side of things later, but if you have people who are not as well educated, maybe it's not common for people in your community to be going off to college. They stay in there, maybe it's a blue collar kind of town, well, you're going to approach people differently, or maybe you have a mix. So that could be something, but think about using that and clarifying that. And I should make sure you understand, none of these are like requirements. All of these things are tools to help you understand your audience better. And so if you struggle, like, I don't know if learning style is something I can describe, don't worry, leave it aside. You don't have to use it. These are ideas for you. Technological skill level. What is their comfort with technology? Are they able to learn it? Is that something that they strive to do? Do they have device preferences? Do they have social media accounts? You probably saw that on some of those examples where we put the little icons on there to say if they're on social media or not. These things help you from a communication standpoint. They may be part of your distinguishing personas, like I said before, with communication preferences, but they might not be. Again, this is a way to get a better picture of how you communicate with that persona. All right, faith background, I mentioned that before. When did they become a Christian? Are they a member or not? If you have community-focused events, you might have different ways of approaching members and non-members. Is that important to them? Is it important to them regardless of their activity? Well, that could change how you talk to them. What about their instruction? How well versed are they? Or have they had their confirmation? Anything like that. Those could be points to consider within your persona. And then church involvement. Worship attendance, are they there regularly? Are they occasional Olivia, like we mentioned before? Bible study attendance, if that's the goal for Christ community, you want to describe what the present situation is for each of those personas. What types of service do they like to perform? Are they really into hands-on kind of stuff? Or are they more of a meeting kind of person who likes to sit back and discuss and strategize? You've got all sorts of different kinds of people that might influence how you view that persona. Interests, skills, passions. What are their interests? Why are they important? What ministries are interesting to them? Really get into that kind of heart matter. That provides the motivation. And if you know somebody's motivation, that helps you communicate with them. I think of our copywriters here on our marketing team. If they know what a pastor really is passionate about, as they write that new book about a commentary, they can talk about why in a busy ministry, it's important to take time to study God's word as a pastor. What's that motivation? Well, it's to prevent a clear picture of God's word, or present a clear picture of God's word. Goals, hopes, intentions. This can get really fun. What are they looking for? Why are they seeking that? Or where are they seeking that? And why are they there? As you think about that, these are the kind of things that I get passionate about as I talk about life in the church. Why are you here? Well, I had a story to share. I want to help other people develop in their faith. That's a really cool motivation. We should be able to share that. Having those kind of, that backstory really helps motivate how you talk to people and what you encourage them to do, what their next steps are. All right. If you have any questions about those are, again, all just ideas. But you can come up with other things. And in fact, I'm sure we have some other things either in the copy or in those templates. You can see that on that PDF that I list a number of things there, like occupation, family, location, but the biography part is a real good area. We also have things like easily identifiable characteristics, personal challenge, personal goals, common objections, all of that. There's so many different ways you can describe it. Please don't lock yourself into just what I presented. All right, well, how are you going to go about and figure out these persona details? You've got your personas identified, you're starting to write it out, but how are you going to accurately do this so it really describes those real people in your church? Well, a lot of research and more than a little intuition. This is not a science, this is an art. So do the research that you can and then go with your gut. I'm a big believer that the things that I pick up on people are what I find most important about them. They shape how I interact with them in the real world, in the day-to-day personal interactions. They shape how I interact with people on a communication standpoint too. Discuss it among your team. Those things that you guys agree on are very likely true, or at least true enough that they will influence your communication. So that's one of the great things about personas, is that as you begin to talk about them, you're speaking the same language. So talk about them with your team. If you don't have a team, we'll have formal and informal conversations with your audience. That was one of the things we did at CTS, is we called customers and we had a number of questions that we asked, and it was all to help us get a better understanding of our personas. Well, you can also survey your audience. We've done a number of CTS surveys, and one of the questions that I love and is painful to see the responses is, what is the biggest challenge in your ministry? And communication is one of those things, getting used to the new tools, having some focus. That's why I'm putting this on, because as we asked you what your biggest challenge are, this came into it. there's a number of other things that came up. And so you'll see that on our blog that we communicate based on challenge points that we heard from our audience. Now, they may not all apply to everybody, but I know they apply to enough people. That's why we do them. So you can think of it in the same way as you are surveying the people in your church or your school or your nonprofit. Look for those things. Ask those questions that'll help build out your profile. And this can be an ongoing basis. You shouldn't just listen to your community once. And that's the next thing, community listening and monitoring. What can be especially hard is if you don't know who your audience is. Like if you don't know who they are personally, you know that they are the people in your neighborhood. You're trying to get them into your church, but you don't know them personally. Well, how do you find out what are they like? Well, community listening, and that's a fun topic that we can't go into in great detail, but finding those points in your community where you can go and learn about people, whether it is the local coffee shop, or I learn a lot about my community by going to community Facebook groups. I find that a lot of people in our community are constantly listening for gunshots or fireworks, trying to figure out which is which. There's a dog that constantly gets off his leash and goes running around the community. They all know him by name. Those are some little interesting tidbits that don't necessarily influence my personas, but they help me understand the community better. Those things tell me that people stay at home quite a bit, even before coronavirus. So see where you can go and listen to your community. And then you can also review the data in your database, whatever that is. I know that if you're using like a church management software, I just did a whole series of training on Church 360 members. We can track so many different things about people that is used for pastoral care, but also like their activities and their involvement. That helps give you a clear picture. You might have an idea of it, but real data is always better than an idea. All right. How do you use personas and lists together? Well, what are lists? We haven't talked about lists yet. Lists and personas and this balance is going to be the focus of the blog post, and I'll share that with you in a little while. But lists are groups of actual people segmented by their preferences or their information. So think about your church management software or your CRM, customer relationship management software. I know a lot of churches are moving into business software to manage their communications. If you're using an emailing software like MailChimp or Constant Contact, you develop lists there that are based on who the different people are. Well, we go into this in a lot more detail, and there's also lists examples in the download that you can look at too. But lists allow you to segment people by what they have stated or what is true about them, their actual information. This is not theoretical. These are actual people in your audience. So personas shape the message, but lists segment the recipients. So if you think about how you receive communication from me, you're on a list that tells me that you are interested in technology. I don't have a technology persona. I have personas based on the role in the church. But for one reason or another, you opted into receiving emails about technology, and that's how you got on that list. Now, it could have been several years ago and you haven't heard from us because we didn't have a message that was appropriate for you in your persona or your list, but somehow you self-identified into that list. So identify which personas should receive each message, and we're really going to get into that when we get into content mapping. But you use that information from the persona for the message itself. You choose the medium based on the persona, but the medium will be influenced by your lists. So if you think about email, you have a very specific list of people. If you think about social media, you have a list. It's the people that follow you, but you don't know who those are. At least you can't, list them all out. You can go see your followers or something like that, but it's still a specific list. If you look at your bulletin list, it's your membership who attends, or your newsletter is your list of people who have an address. But it's important to remember that you communicate with the persona. Look at them, not, well, hello, bulletin subscribers. Talk about it, talk about the message with the people who are your personas. Keep that individual identity alive there. All right, so when the message and the persona are incongruent, you always have to ask, is this the right message? If it doesn't, if you're struggling to write the message because of who your persona is. It may be the wrong message for that persona, and you have to flip that message around to say, why is this important for them? In the same way, if the lists in the persona are incongruent, say, is this the right list? Maybe you've got a list in your church management software and you see your personas that you've identified and you're like, all right, well, this message is for this persona, Millennial Melody, and of the 25 people on my list, 3 of them fit under Millennial Melody. Well, then it's probably the wrong list. Now, you can certainly have a list of your personas too, but I'm guessing you're going to have lists based on more specific things. And if you look at the download, I've got a number of different options there, and that is just the starting point. When I think about our organization at CPH, I had to do a cleanup of our list, take us down from 1,100 down to 700. We have a lot of lists because we get very specific. Now, personas, we have less than 8. So that shows you the difference between personas and lists, or at least it should. So the TLDR for today, too long didn't read or too long didn't watch the whole thing, or maybe you're just tuning in and you want to see what I've been talking about. Personas represent the unique audiences of your church. Everyone in your audience should be matched to a persona in some way, shape, or form. How you divide up those personas will determine how you match the individuals with your audience in there. And then personas shape your messaging. Lists filter your recipients. That distinction is going to be key. And we're really going to get into the practical, actual actions in the last 3 sessions. We're more high level right now, but it's important to understand that distinction right now, which is why the blog post today, which is launching, looks like I went 6 minutes over, not terrible. The blog post is launching in 4 minutes on concordiatechnology.org/blog. It's about the proper use of personas and lists in church communication. And we'll go through that distinction. There's also a free download, which you have been seeing during this presentation. You can download it in the handout section right now. If you have any trouble with that, put a note in the chat, but it should be pretty easy. Otherwise, you can get it at the bottom of the blog post. You'll just have to fill out a form. Now, since last time, I introduced a Facebook group for this course. You can access it at that link there, facebook.com/group/church communications strategy. You are welcome to go and join that. I do have it as a closed group just because I want to make sure that it doesn't get full of spam or anything like that. So I do have that as a closed group. So if you request to join, just know that I'll be accepting your approval pretty soon. I'm not spreading this wide and far, so anybody who is asking for it, I'm going to accept, well, unless you start spamming the group, but we haven't had that issue yet. But I encourage you to go in there. I'm sharing all the different resources. I'm tying it into different units so that you can kind of see how it's grouped together. I would encourage you to join that. Now, before I get into question and answers, I want to talk about next week. It's journey maps, planning your ideal path. And I got to tell you, this is one of my favorite topics, if not the favorite topic in the course, because journey maps really start to take that high-level strategic planning, and you'll see the practical implications of it. And you can start basically telling a story. Now, people in your audience are going to be at different paths along the story, and you might have multiple stories, multiple journey maps, but it's a lot of fun to start going through this process. And when I present this course live in person, this is when I typically see everybody's eyes kind of light up and be like, oh, that's cool. This is exciting. I now understand what we're doing, what we're doing wrong, what we could be doing better. So I'm excited to show that to you next week. Now it's time for the Q&A. I'm going to pause for a second, grab a drink, because I've been talking for 58 minutes at this point. But if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Now, I've got 2 minutes left in my hour. If you have to leave, if you have to go to something else, don't feel bad. We're still recording this. Be sharing the answers in the recording, at least as many as I can get through. Last week, I went on for about 10, 15 minutes, then I cut it off, and I tried to respond to emails via email afterwards. Some of you didn't get a response until Thursday or Friday, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to try to get you an answer for everything. Some of the questions I may not respond to, and I'll save them for later on. They might be better addressed later. But feel free to either enter them into the chat right now or send me an email with them. Let's go ahead and James, thank you very much for being on there and answering questions. That's so helpful. If you guys received answers during that, that's from James, not from me. I couldn't type and talk at the same time. All right, so let's go through here. And so Reverend Bose says, we also send out weekly midweek minutes to keep membership informed. That has proven quite helpful. That is a cool strategy to do that on a regular basis. All right, Stephanie is asking, how do you know you really know your audience and persona? Do you use surveys? Well, that's a really good question. How do you really know? Well, you don't. You should review them on a regular basis. You don't have to do them, every month, every campaign. But I think if you start seeing that your communication efforts aren't as effective as they were, well, then that might be a good time to say, is it a persona issue? Or if you have an annual communication planning process, it's a good time to say, are these still relevant? Is this still the best way to distinguish my personas? So how will you know them, whether they're the right personas? That's an ongoing effort, but the first place is to start. And as you start and you learn, you may tweak some things. And that's what we've done here all the time. Our personas that we have now that went through this last round of our business planning process, we've been using them since, what was that, July? Well, they were a little bit different before that. How we distinguished them was a bit different. So it's an ongoing process. You're never going to be 100% right because it's a generalization. And sometimes people aren't going to fit as well as you might hope. But again, it's a generalization that helps you be a little bit more focused. Robert says, still doing both newsletter and bulletin, trying new ways with electronic. Sound like we need to tailor different types of communication to different personas. You got that right. That's the kind of stuff that you'll see as we get into these different channels, social media and your website. All right, let's see. Sounds like, Stephanie follows up, sounds like stereotypes. How do you use personas without being stereotypical? Well, I think, stereotypes are typically seen as negative. And so you don't want anything negative in here. Talk about the positive things about these people, what motivates them, why they're doing these things. There might be some negative aspects to it, but as I described with older adult Alice, that's when I'm always a little bit nervous about saying that she's fearing losing her independence. But I spent a summer working at it's a nursing home and a facility for older adults at all levels of care. But regardless of what level of care they were at, that independence thing was really key to all of them and at various levels. And so I know that really influenced their day-to-day life. And so as that persona is a person who's getting older, that's a motivating factor. And you could say, well, yeah, the people in that age range, they're all afraid of losing their independence. Is that a stereotype? Maybe, but it's not meant to put them in a negative light. It's meant to reflect the reality of the situation. So I think it depends on how you write it. You're not going to be doing, unless if you're dividing your personas based on gender, you have to be really careful there, but that should be because your goals are based on gender. Like I said before, is it that you're trying to grow a men's or women's Bible study or ministry? Well, that might be why you distinguish by that. If you look at ethnicity or race, if you're dividing by that, you're going to be in really shaky grounds. But maybe it's because, like in my community, we have a lot of immigrants who are from like Turkey in that area. Well, this isn't saying that we're going to make judgments on those who are from Turkey or any kind of call on them. It's just that we know that that community is large in our neighborhood. So you have to be careful, but I think if you're being sensitive and you're doing it for the right reasons, you're going to steer away from anything that sounds like a stereotype. All right, next up, Lori says, we have a gap in getting the single young adult contact information after confirmation. Contact information after confirmation. Still dependents, youth living at home. Do you have any tips, tools, when and how to track them? Parents usually have home email logged on rosters. Lori, that is, yeah, absolutely. That is a challenge that we face. We just went through that at my church. We wanted to send the high school graduates, this was last summer, high school graduates, a free book that is a devotional book for college grads, featured at Concordia Publishing House. But we wanted to give that away for them for free. We had trouble reaching them, and we even reached out to the parents. Well, it's going to be a challenge, but I think that's why The relationship side of thing is going to continue to be important. If you have to, call up the parents and say, what's the best way to get a hold of them? If I mail this to you, will you give this to them? It's going to vary by person. There's not going to be a tried and true method. But I think at that time in kids' life, when they are in, let me make sure, single young adult contact information, so much has changed that their circumstances themselves make it difficult to know their contact information, because they've gone from a school email address to now maybe a personal email. They've gone from a school or home address to now their own apartment or house. They're focused on work if they're in that post-college graduate, so they might have a work email address. It's gonna be tough, and so you can do what you can. But as we get into content and the whole content map, what you're gonna wanna do is draw them in through means like social media, where you may not know exactly who you're reaching, but you know the kind of content that would be interesting to them. A local church in the St. Louis area is hosting a webinar, or maybe earlier on today. I'm going to try to catch the follow-up about raising digital citizens. Kids, as they're going online, how do you help them to be good digital citizens? Well, they don't have me in their database by any means, but that topic interests me, and I saw it shared by a friend on Facebook. And so I'm going to reach out and look into that because it interests me. Well, I'm going to sign up, and they're going to have my name and email. So those kind of things are how you start to draw them in, allow them to give you their preferred contact method, but that requires you to have some kind of carrot at the end of the stick that draws them in. So there's a few ideas. We'll talk about some more, maybe not for that particular audience, although I can try to use them as an example later on. Oh, and I saw the other thing, self-reporting does not seem to interest them. Well, that kind of goes into what your content is. Let's see, Millennial Melody and our church are not about fellowship, career networking, and how to earn a living. It's going to be different. All right, Chris is saying, would you ever ever put someone, I think, in two persona groups? If you're putting them in two persona groups, then you may not have your personas split by the same measure, if that makes sense. So if their communication preferences is how you split personas, well, they probably have one preference over another. Or if their demographics are how you split them, they should have different demographics and fall into different ones. So that's where how you split them is going to be based off your goals. Where you put the person, they should only fit into one. If they don't fit into one, you may not have a clear enough distinction between your personas. Does that make sense? If you've got buckets that are supposed to be mutually exclusive, then you may not have your criteria if you're getting a Venn diagram. All right, what about those people who fall outside the personas? Do you put them in the personas that closely matches their communication style? We have senior church members who are fairly social media savvy and middle agers who have no internet, no smartphone. I think he's talking about this now. Yeah, you can always extend beyond that. If it's based on communication preferences, then you might have one where they're hard to reach. If it's based on demographics, well, you might have add another one that fits that gap. I would caution you to not split your personas based on two different things. So communication methods is certainly one way to split them, but you might split them, let's go based on interest. We talked about that school example. They're focused on faith, they're focused on athletics, they're focused on academics. Those type of people may have no difference of communication preferences, but you might have somebody who's focused on healthy eating in the cafeteria. If you have enough of them, that might make sense to put them as a new persona. Or if there's only one person, but they say that's their highest priority, well, then you start to think which one matches them best. Well, healthy eating probably ties in more to athletics than academics. So we'll put them in there because it best describes them. So that's where I think you have to look at how you split up your personas. And if you need to add one, you do, or if you need to stretch a little bit with a person, find the one that works best. Lori says, I find millennials are very private and only tap in if it's specifically something they want. So hard to generate interest, grow the demographic from scratch. You are absolutely right. Growing demographics from scratch is always going to be hard. Like I mentioned before with the people in your community, how do you know about them if you don't know them? Well, that's where you start going to places, either online or in person, where they hang out. And don't talk to them there, listen to them. If you listen to them, you're going to get a better understanding about them and find out what they need. But if you try to share what you have with an audience who doesn't have that need, they're not going to respond. Even if you get their attention, they're not going to respond. That's why you have to start with that persona and what they need. And this has so many implications outside of just persona too. Listening is always better than telling. And so start by listening and find out what they need. I'll go back to that webinar example. I just thought it was so good. What they heard is, we are in the coronavirus crisis. Our kids are on technology more than they've ever been before, and I'm worried about them. How can I prevent them from being the kind of trolls that are online? Or how can I prevent them from being influenced by those trolls? So the church saw that and say, what can we do to help? How can we meet that need? Well, we can talk about being a good digital citizen. That was not them coming out and saying, you need to be a good digital citizen. It's them learning that that's a need. So that's your first step. If you don't know about them, if you don't have that audience internally that you can talk about, go out and find them, talk with them. Talk with them face to face, learn about them. If you have contact information, you can survey them, but it sounds like you probably don't. And I bet you a lot of those goals that we have, those stretch goals where we're getting beyond our status quo, you're gonna need to do some research first to find out what those needs are. Jeremy says, do you recommend creating different persona profiles for each communication or project, or do you continue to assign more attributes to personas, such as lifelong Larry, who is also on a fixed interest and has no interest in school, or a regular parishioner with no spare income and always seems interested in academics? Well, I hate to say that it depends, but I think that's where you have your mission and you have your mission statement, your status quo, what you are as a church and where you strive to be. And I think as your goals change, you may have to shift how you split up your personas. And at that time, you say, all right, we're going to revise our personas. And the things from our mission are still going to influence it. We're going to describe our personas in that way, but we're going to split how we divide it up. If your goals continue, if your goals change year after year, but your division still works, then you can keep those personas and say, as I look at this, this really describes our audience well and how we're going to choose to distinguish it. Last year we were focused on increasing Bible study attendance. This year we're focusing on launching a mission event. Those, our division is on participation, and it still applies regardless of which one it is. So I hate to say it depends, but it really depends. You could always assign more attributes if it provides more context to what your emphasis is this year. There's no harm in that. As long as it fits that profile, great. Or you may say that this one persona doesn't seem to be right. I'm going to take this out and put a new one in that better describes those people, may pull a few people away from other personas. We've done that before, specifically when I was working with our music team. This idea of a music person in a church, we had everybody under one bucket and we realized, no, it's really two. Service planning and musicians are two very different types of people. It's in the realm of music, but we interact with them as a publishing house differently. And so we split those up. So yeah, it depends, but hopefully that helped a little bit distinguish between those. Oops, pardon me for making a chime with my one. Let's see, Sarah says, am I understanding correctly, you suggest you make personas for specific goals? So with each goal, we create new personas. We also make personas for the whole church generally. I'm suggesting that that's where you start, that you look at who your church is as a whole first, generally speaking. How do we divide it up? Can we align our goals with that? Or do all of our personas go into one goal, or do all of our goals fit for only one persona? You want to start splitting that up. You might have some personas that don't relate to your goal at all, and you might have some goals that have more than one persona. It's a many-to-many relationship, which those are always the toughest to get your head around, but that's the reality of that. It depends on how specific your goals are to individual audiences. If they're very broad goals, which aren't a bad thing, if they involve everybody in the church, well, then you may not need to have specific personas for those goals. The goals will influence personas in your church in different ways. So I can't say for sure in any given situation without knowing the situation, but I hope that helps you just understand how you'd use that. And I think as we get into content mapping, we'll talk about the journey map with personas. And as we get into content, I think you're really going to see how to make that distinction. If your content is the same for all personas, well, then you might not have divided up your personas properly. If all the content revolves around one thing and it kind of works for everybody, your personas may not be distinguished enough. And that may mean looking back again at your goals in your church. Can you share, next up from Heather, can you share the 12 personas profiles, a slide and PowerPoint? I will be putting the slide deck in our resource center, so yes. Alliteration, Colleen, thank you. I know this is quite a bit ago, but that's the word I was looking for. Alliteration is when the beginning sounds the same. Thank you so much, Colleen. My wife was an English major. I struggle with the English language, so I appreciate that help. She would have known that right away. I'm glad you did. All right. What are the social media icons? Pastor Cooley is asking that. Let me jump back to a slide real quick, and I can show you what I mean. This one's a little bit hard to see, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you look to the left of where it says Andy McWidget, you can see a Twitter icon, a LinkedIn icon, and a Facebook icon. Or if I jump over to mine, again, it's going to be small, but if you look at the very bottom on the one on the left, there's some lightly faded icons, and we say that Treasurer Tom is really only active on LinkedIn. That's just our persona for him. So it's a easy way of saying which social media channels is this persona on. So I hope that helps answer that. Gary says, this work requires a team, I think. I think everyone would agree with you that a team is the best way to go about doing this. Unfortunately, not everybody has the team. As an individual, if that's your situation, Gary or anyone else, you can certainly go through this on your own. It can be even a little bit less formal, because as you get this idea of it, you're the only one who has to know that. But yeah, teams always work better for something like this. Brian says, loving this class. I'm glad to hear that. As you work with volunteers who are looking for team members, do you have a quick and easy way to create personas? Say, develop a target audience in 5 to 10 minutes or less. I think, well, if you say audience in a singular sense, let's say you have a campaign. We are launching Vacation Bible School. It's a big campaign. Our target audience is young families who have kids within this age range. And I know that that's not the majority of my congregation. That is a subset of my congregation. And so if my campaign is all about increasing registration at Vacation Bible School, I can narrow it down pretty quickly based on that specific detail. It's, the audience is the kids, therefore our communication audience is the parents. Well, parents with kids between the ages of 4 and 12 have a lot in common. Now, can we make distinctions among them? Can we create multiple personas for that? Sure, we can, but I don't know if we need to. So it depends on that situation, but I think a lot of things in the church are, especially in the church, you're able to figure out your persona, your audience very quickly. Now, it starts to get a little bit harder in things like schools, where yes, you have that persona, you have that age range of elementary school or preschool or whatever your school is. Well, you've already narrowed it down. That's your entire organization is narrowed down to that group. How do you distinguish your communication so that it's truly relevant? That might be a little bit harder. So yeah, I don't know if I have a quick and easy way, but I think it's going to depend on the situation. Some situations are going to be a lot easier. Does CTS offer unbiased research tools to use? I find leaders tend to skew questions to the answers they want to hear. We don't have anything right now. We do have one resource on staff who is just fantastic. Ken Olemeyer is a member of our team. His job is to go out and talk with churches, and he has a lot of experience doing this in professional settings. In fact, at my church, as we're talking about researching for a specific goal, we've had Ken come and talk with us. I am sure he'd be willing to help you out as well. Now, I don't think he could do it for everybody who signed up. It's not a business of ours, but I'm sure he could lend you a few minutes of advice. And if we have enough people who are interested, maybe we could do a separate session with him. He's got some great ideas, and he might even be watching. So if he is, kudos to you, Ken. You're excellent. Let's see. Next up, we have attempted. I think you meant we have attempted a few surveys over the year and have various success and various results that are viewed in different ways from our leaders. Are there some tips for success, and are there some things to avoid? Gary's asking that question, and we've had that same kind of thing at our church. I mean, that's part of why we asked Ken to come in. We've had some success with surveys in the past, and we've had some complete failures. What we have found works is if we can state what the goal is. Now, you're not going to go out and say, we are developing personas for our church. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself? There's no real vested interest in your congregation by doing that. But if you say, we want to make sure that you are receiving the right communications in the way that you want to receive them, would you help tell us a little bit about your preferences and yourself so we can tailor our communication to you? Well, that might work a little bit better. In fact, I know of a church in Florida who did that very thing, and they had great results. Now, they had to remind people, they had to do it in church, they had to take some time and say that. But they provided that carrot, again, using that analogy, they provided that carrot at the end of the stick that drew them in. So that would be my recommendation. There's a Q&A asking about Facebook recording of the first session. Yes, we do have the first session available. All right, what next? What's a realistic number of personas to manage? This seems like it could be endless. Yes, I recommend 8 or less, and 8 is on the high side. Mark is asking a Church 360 question. What's the difference between lists and tags in Church 360? Now that might be, outside of Church 360, how you group the people in your database will vary. There's really no distinction there. Lists and tags are just different ways of segmenting your audience. Let's see. I'm going to go through. I'm already 20 minutes past my time. So I'm going to just take a few more, and then I'll try to follow up with those of you who have questions that I haven't answered afterwards. Rebecca's saying, trying to sort out the relationship between personas and goals. Does an understanding of your audience and the personas help drive your goals, or vice versa? I think you have presented a very valid question. Chicken and the egg. Does your audience drive your goals, or do your goals drive your audience? Well, I think it's a both and in some ways, but I think if you look at your mission statement first, why you exist as a congregation and who you are right now, you're going to have a good idea of your audiences to start. Your goals should stretch besides that, stretch beyond that. That's the word I'm looking for. Your goals should stretch beyond your mission. If your goal is about reaching a new audience, well, I think you have your answer right there. Your goal drives your audience, because as you look at your situation, that's where the SWOT comes in. You look at your situation, your opportunities, that gives you that extra stretch. Well, certainly you should have an audience tied to that goal. But sometimes you may look at your audiences, your different personas, and say, well, how are we going to reach those? Those aren't really changing. What can we do to engage them more? But I think more often than not, it's going to start with your mission and your goals, and your audience is going to flow from there. And again, remember that this is for your communication strategy. If it helps you communicate better with people, that's where you make that distinction. So it's not necessarily always dividing up your people based on who they are, but it's how you want to communicate with them. There's a lot of overlap there. How you communicate with them is based on who they are. But it is communication first for these personas. I don't know if that helped or not. Stephanie, who's already left, said, how do you decide between persona identifications, communication, participation, demographic, interests? I think that's a really good question. I'm sorry she's not here to hear this, but it's gonna be what feels right. As you look at those, I picked examples that really felt right. If you go at the school example, I could have gone by demographics, but there's not a lot of difference in age range for people who have kids that potentially could be going to that school. So it's not an easy way to distinguish that. Now you could get really narrow focused and say people in their 20s, people in their 30s, people in their 40s who have school-aged kids. You might have some outliers in their 50s. That's probably not the best way to do it. So what really feels right? Now some of it is just knowing your audience and knowing how you approach them differently. But I hate to say it's about feelings, but I like to do, my team knows I say the smell test. If that doesn't really smell right, like, yeah, that's struggle, that's probably not right. Do goals need to be established before a persona? I think that's pretty similar to what we were talking about before. I think so in most cases. What makes developing personas unsuccessful? Heather's asking a great question. How would you go about doing this in an unsuccessful way? Well, there's a lot of different ways, but I think the most common one is if by the time you're done developing your personas, if it doesn't influence your communication, if you still find that, yeah, I can communicate to all these personas in the same way, well, then that's an unsuccessful attempt. Again, this is a communication tactic, or not tactic, communication best practice. If it doesn't influence your communication at all, then it was unsuccessful. How do you really keep up with people moving from persona to persona? Mark's already left on that one, but what I can tell you is that goes into journey maps. If your personas are on different stages of the journey maps, and we'll talk about that next week, whether you have a journey map for a persona or personas along the journey map. Spoiler alert, the answer is maybe either. That's when you will distinguish that. So I'll help you with that next week. Who should review your personas? Is this like a committee effort? Well, it should be any of the leadership, your communication leadership and the leadership in your church. These first 4 sessions should involve people who are leaders in your church. You should have a good consensus about this. You may not be able to get everybody on board with reviewing personas, but get who you can. It's always good to run those past other people. Warren is asking a very timely question. How can we best optimize personas and targeted communication during COVID-19? I think this points back to one of the questions I think Jeremy had before about the specific campaigns. Would you do a persona for a specific campaign? Well, during this COVID crisis, if you look at what personas you have, if you have them, or as you go about developing them, think about this being the distinction. When you go, how would you communicate with them differently? Well, I might communicate with some people over social media because that's where they're spending a lot of time on their phones right now. But the people that are at home and don't use social media, I might want to call them or mail them things. So I think communication right now is probably a very good way of dividing people up, because in terms of involvement in activities, even among demographics, everybody's staying at home. So it's really hard to distinguish elsewhere, but communication can still be a good way to distinguish between. Now, it could be that demographics imply communication and you go that route instead. But as you get into, let's talk about the why for a second. Right now, we are at a point in our church where people are getting out of the habit of worship. They're getting out of the habit of attending a Bible study. These habits that they've been doing for years and years have been broken, and not just in church, in all areas. How can we ensure that those habits continue, those positive habits continue? How can we help people develop new habits? As we're live streaming at our church, I'm seeing people tune in, friends on Facebook who I haven't seen in church in a while, but then I see that they're watching with me with the service. Like, that's an exciting opportunity. That's something that's happening with COVID-19 that could draw them back into the church. Maybe they were ashamed about their attendance lapsing, and they're like, well, if I don't go, no one will say anything about me not being there, but I can watch online. You can take advantage of that. But I could share all sorts of ideas. That's not really the topic today, but that might be a good topic to put into the Facebook channel. And that's another thing. What I might do is rather than email everybody, or maybe I'll email some of you directly and post some of these in the Facebook group as well. All right, I'm going to go with one more question because we are almost at the end, or at 2:30. And I know a lot of you have dropped off. There's still quite a few of you who are here, so thanks for being here this whole time. Let's see. Let me go down here. Wow, this is a quick one. Personas would possibly be edited or revised as new goals are adopted. Absolutely. I think that's something you always review them, edit them as needed. But yeah, absolutely. All right, the last one. We found at least 5 different preferences for communication by simply asking at the end of worship. Gary brought that up, and I think that is a very good point. If you just ask people a very pointed question, what's your communication preference? They're going to tell you, and you may get things that you didn't expect, but now you're that much smarter. And if that's not how you're dividing up your personas by communication preference, it's still data points and understanding of your audience that you could use as part of your persona profiles. So maybe you have 8 persona profiles and you have 5 communication preferences and you're dividing it up by demographics. Well, you now have some different things. Say, okay, well, these 2 personas have this preference for communication. So I can communicate with them, I'm going by email. These 3 over here are all social media. This one is about printed bulletins, and this one's about printed newsletters, something like that. If you ask, you're going to find out good information. If you guess, you're going to be all right. But asking is always better. And so those formal and informal conversations are always extremely helpful. All right, well, I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to wrap up. But thank you so much for being here. Special thanks to James for answering questions in the chat. Special thanks to all of you for being here and participating. If you didn't hear me answer your question, I'm going to try to get back to you. It might be later this week. It might be on the Facebook group. So be sure to sign the Facebook group. Otherwise, look for an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to the recording, a link to the blog post, and a link to the download. Thanks so much. Have a great day.